Heinrich Himmler was one of the primary architects of the Holocaust. He built and ran the SS, oversaw the concentration camp system, and signed the orders that sent millions of people to their deaths. He was also, by all accounts, a devoted father who called his daughter every day when they were apart and sent her weekly letters when the phone wasn't enough. He had a pet name for her, Püppi, little doll. He flew her to his Berlin offices so she could spend time with him. He brought her to official functions. By every measure available to a child, she was loved completely by a man who was simultaneously organizing industrial murder on a scale the world had never seen. His daughter's name was Gudrun. She was born in 1929, which made her 10 years old when the war started, and 15 when it ended. She grew up inside the architecture of the Third Reich, the way other children grow up inside their family's profession. It was simply the world, the only one she knew, and the man at the center of it called her his little doll and made sure she knew she was the most important thing in his life. When Himmler was captured by British forces in May 1945 and died by biting into a hidden cyanide capsule, Gudrun refused to accept the official account. For the rest of her life, and her life extended to 2018, 73 years past the end of the war, she insisted her father had been assassinated. She never revised this position. She never revised anything. What happened to the children of the men who built the Third Reich is one of the strangest and most psychologically revealing chapters in the entire aftermath of the Second World War. These were people who had no choice in who their fathers were, no agency in what those fathers did, and no ability to process any of it until they were old enough to understand what the names they carried actually meant to the rest of the world. Some of them spent their lives defending the indefensible. Some spent their lives in a kind of public penance that never felt sufficient. Some simply tried to disappear. And some found themselves caught between a love they couldn't reason away and a horror they couldn't justify, living in that impossible space for decades without resolution. None of their stories are simple. That's precisely what makes them worth understanding. Gudrun Himmler's post-war life began in American custody. She and her mother were detained after Germany's surrender and held in a series of camps across Italy, France, and Germany before being summoned to Nuremberg to provide testimony at the trials. They were released in November 1946. Gudrun was 17. She had spent the last year and a half as a prisoner of the Allied forces her father had spent years fighting, testifying at the trials of the men her father had worked alongside. Whatever process of reckoning that experience might have initiated in another person, it did not initiate in Gudrun. She emerged from it more committed to her father's memory than before, as though the experience of being treated as the enemy had confirmed something she already believed about whose side she was on. She became a central figure in an organization called Stille Hilfe, Silent Aid, a secretive network dedicated to providing support to former SS members who were arrested, condemned, or in hiding. The organization helped fugitive war criminals with legal assistance, financial support, and logistical help evading capture. Gudrun was not a peripheral member. She was deeply embedded in its operations for decades, working consistently and deliberately to protect the men who had carried out her father's orders. She attended the trials of convicted war criminals and sat with their families in the courtroom. She visited SS veterans in prison. She maintained correspondence with men the rest of the world had classified as monsters. She did all of this not as a young woman in the immediate shock of defeat, but continuously across 7 decades, until she died in 2018 at the age of 88. There is no evidence she ever experienced anything that functioned as doubt. Martin Bormann, Jr. arrived at his reckoning by a completely different route. His father, Martin Bormann Sr., was one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi hierarchy. Hitler's private secretary, the man who controlled access to the Führer in the final years of the regime, someone whose influence exceeded his official title considerably. Bormann Sr. disappeared in the chaos of Berlin's fall in May 1945 and was tried in absentia at Nuremberg and sentenced to death. His remains were eventually identified in 1998, confirming he had died fleeing the city. His son was 15 when the war ended. The younger Bormann had been raised inside the regime's inner circle, but sheltered from the specific details of what his father's position actually involved. The confrontation with that reality came after the war, through the Nuremberg trials and the documentation that emerged from them, and it broke something open in him that never fully closed again. He converted to Catholicism and was ordained as a priest. He went to work in the mission fields of Congo and Cameroon, putting as much physical and moral distance between himself and his father's legacy as geography allowed. He dedicated his life, deliberately and publicly, to the kind of service that represented the direct opposite of everything his father had stood for. He spoke openly about his father's crimes. He did not defend or minimize. He carried the weight of the name with what appeared to be genuine anguish and tried to do something useful with the years he had. Then, in 2011, allegations surfaced from a former student, claiming that Bormann had abused him when he was 12 years old in the early 1960s. Additional accusations of severe physical violence against other students followed. By the time these allegations emerged, Bormann was suffering from dementia and could not respond to them. No legal action resulted, but the independent Klasnik Commission, established to investigate abuse within the Catholic Church in Austria, awarded compensation to one of the accusers, which represented an institutional finding that something had happened. The man who had spent his life trying to build something decent on the ruins of his father's name died with his own name complicated by accusations he could never answer. The story of Martin Bormann Jr. resists any clean conclusion, which may be the most honest thing about it. Nicholas Frank chose confrontation as his method, and he chose it early, and he never stopped. His father was Hans Frank, Hitler's personal lawyer, later the Governor-General of occupied Poland, the man responsible for the administration of the territory in which the majority of the Holocaust's Polish victims lived and died. Hans Frank was known as the Butcher of Poland. He kept detailed diaries throughout the war that documented his knowledge of and participation in mass murder with a specificity that made him one of the easier cases to prosecute at Nuremberg. He was convicted and hanged in October 1946. His son Nicholas was 7 years old. Nicholas Frank grew up, educated himself about what his father had done, and then spent the rest of his life refusing to let anyone forget it, including himself. He wrote books, he gave lectures, he traveled to schools and universities and spoke directly to young people about his father's crimes and their consequences. His most significant book, translated into English as In the Shadow of the Reich, is one of the most uncomfortable documents in the literature of the Third Reich's aftermath. Not because it defends his father, but because it doesn't. It is a sustained, unflinching examination of a man Nicholas Frank clearly despised and was clearly haunted by simultaneously, written by someone who understood that the haunting was permanent and had decided to make it productive. He carried a photograph of his father's corpse on the gallows in his wallet for years. When journalists asked him why, he said it helped him remember what his father actually was, rather than allowing sentiment to construct something softer in its place. His commitment to this kind of active remembrance put him at odds with some survivors and some historians who questioned whether a perpetrator's child had the standing to occupy this particular public role. It also put him permanently at odds with his siblings, most of whom had chosen very different ways of living with the same history. Nicholas Frank's approach was aggressive and deliberate, and consistently maintained across decades. Whatever it cost him privately, he kept going. Etta Göring took the opposite path. Her father was Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, Hitler's designated successor for most of the war, president of the Reichstag, founder of the Gestapo, one of the most powerful and recognizable figures in the entire Nazi hierarchy. Etta was born in 1938, Göring's only child with his second wife, the actress Emmy Sonnemann. Her early childhood was spent at Karenhall, the enormous Göring family estate north of Berlin, surrounded by art, luxury, and the particular atmosphere of a household that occupied the absolute center of power in a regime built on terror. She was photographed constantly, a symbol of Nazi domesticity, the regime's attempt to project an image of wholesome family life onto a structure built from murder. Among the gifts Etta received in childhood was a painting by Lucas Cranach the Elder, a Renaissance masterpiece, and the question of how Hermann Göring had acquired this and the thousands of other artworks that filled Karenhall was answered at Nuremberg, through systematic looting from Jewish families, museums, and occupied territories across Europe. Etta spent decades in legal disputes, trying to retain artwork from her childhood, and lost most of those disputes in 1968 when German courts ruled against her claims. Hermann Göring was sentenced to death at Nuremberg and cheated the hangman by swallowing a cyanide capsule the night before his execution. He died as he had presumably intended, on his own terms, denying the Allies the specific satisfaction of the gallows. His daughter maintained, privately and consistently, that he was a good man. She said so in the one significant public interview she gave, a Swedish television appearance in 1986, in which she broke a decades-long public silence to express her love for both her parents. Otherwise, she lived quietly, out of the public eye, declining to engage with the history her father had helped make. She died in 2018, the same year as Gudrun Himmler, at the age of 80. She had spent her entire adult life in the gravitational field of a name she couldn't escape, and had apparently never stopped believing in the man who gave it to her. Rolf Mengele had to be lied to before he could be sheltered. His father was Josef Mengele, the SS physician at Auschwitz who conducted medical experiments on prisoners, selected new arrivals for the gas chambers, and became one of the most hunted war criminals in history. Josef Mengele fled to South America after the war and spent the rest of his life in hiding across Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. Protected by networks of former Nazis and sympathizers, successfully evading capture until he died of a stroke while swimming in 1979. His son Rolf was raised in Germany believing his father had been a war hero who died in the conflict. He was a teenager before he learned the truth. The truth, when it arrived completely. Rolf Mengele learned not just that his father was alive, but what his father had done. The experiments, the selections, the specific and documented cruelty that had made the name Mengele into something that survivors could barely speak. He studied law, became a corporate lawyer, built a life that was as deliberately unremarkable as possible under the circumstances. But the letters kept coming. Josef Mengele maintained contact with his son from hiding, and in 1977, Rolf made the decision to travel to South America and meet the man he had been told was dead. What he found there was not remorse. Josef Mengele acknowledged what he had done at Auschwitz and attempted to explain it, to rationalize the experiments, to contextualize the selections, to construct some framework within which his actions could be understood as something other than what they were. Rolf Mengele listened to all of it, and despised his father for it. He returned to Germany, having seen the man clearly and having been given nothing that helped him carry the name. But he didn't tell anyone where his father was hiding. He kept that information to himself, and Joseph Mengele died 2 years later without ever facing a court. Rolf later said that he simply couldn't bring himself to make the call, that he hated his father and everything his father represented, but that the specific act of betrayal was something he couldn't do. He changed his name after his father's death was confirmed, disappeared into private life, and is believed to be living quietly in Germany as a retired attorney. Wolf Hess spent his life on the same side of the argument as Gudrun Himmler, though his father's story had a different shape. Rudolf Hess was Hitler's deputy Führer until May 1941, when he did something that still confounds historians. He flew a solo mission to Scotland in what appears to have been a personal attempt to negotiate a peace agreement with Britain, an act that Hitler publicly disavowed as the behavior of a madman. Hess was captured, held as a prisoner of war in Britain throughout the conflict, then tried at Nuremberg, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment. He served that sentence at Spandau Prison in Berlin until he died in 1987 at the age of 93, the last prisoner in a facility that had been built for hundreds, maintained at enormous expense by the 4 Allied powers, specifically to hold one old man who never stopped being a symbol of the war that had defined the century. He was found hanged with an electrical cord, officially ruled a suicide, a conclusion Wolf Hess never accepted. Wolf Hess dedicated his life to his father's rehabilitation with the kind of focus that might have accomplished something remarkable if it had been directed anywhere else. In the 1950s, he established the Committee to Free Rudolf Hess, which amassed several 100,000 supporters and attracted the support of notable figures in German politics. He wrote books arguing that his father was not a war criminal, but simply a man doing his duty, who had then made a courageous and unauthorized attempt at peace. He campaigned continuously for his father's release, arguing that the continued imprisonment of an elderly man who had never been convicted of crimes against humanity specifically represented a political act by the Allies, rather than a judicial one. There were people who found this argument at least partially compelling. After his father's death, Wolf argued that the suicide ruling was a cover for murder by British intelligence, a claim for which no credible evidence emerged. He died in 2001, having spent his entire adult life in service to a cause that history had already resolved against him. Albert Speer Jr. had perhaps the most psychologically complex starting point of any of them, because his father was the most psychologically complex figure among the senior Nazis. Albert Speer Sr. was Hitler's primary architect and later armaments minister, a man of genuine talent who had placed that talent entirely in service of the Reich, and who had extended the war through his organizational genius and his ruthless exploitation of slave labor. He was convicted at Nuremberg and sentenced to 20 years in prison. What made Speer Sr. different from most of the other defendants was that he expressed remorse, genuine or calculated. The question was never fully resolved, and presented himself as someone who had been seduced by power and proximity to genius into complicity he should have resisted. He became, in some accounts, the good Nazi, the one who acknowledged guilt. Other accounts concluded that his remorse was a performance calibrated to save his life, and that his claims of ignorance about the Holocaust were almost certainly false. His son Albert Jr. grew up in Heidelberg with his grandparents after his father's imprisonment, developing a severe stutter under the pressure of his circumstances that he eventually overcame. He trained as a carpenter, then redirected toward architecture, the same profession as his father, a coincidence he spent years insisting was not the influence it looked like. He became a successful architect in his own right, built a career and a reputation on his own terms, and maintained a consistent public position of not wanting to discuss his father at all. In a 2010 interview, he said he had tried his whole life to separate himself from his father, to put distance between who he was and what his father's name represented. He didn't defend. He didn't denounce. He simply refused the conversation as completely as he could manage. He died in Frankfurt at 83, having spent 8 decades trying to be someone other than Albert Speer's son, with mixed results, as was probably inevitable. What connects all of these lives, the defenders, the penitents, the silent ones, the confronters, is the impossibility of the position they were placed in before they were old enough to understand what a position was. They did not choose their fathers. They did not choose what their fathers did. They arrived into consciousness inside families where monstrous men were simply fathers. Men who called their daughters little doll and flew them to Berlin for visits. Men who wrote letters and made phone calls and were, in the specific and limited world of their own households, present and warm and human in ways that the historical record refuses to acknowledge, because acknowledging it complicates the moral clarity we need from that period. The moral clarity is still correct. Heinrich Himmler organized the Holocaust. Hermann Göring looted Europe and commanded the bombing of civilian populations. Hans Frank administered the murder of millions. Josef Mengele tortured and killed prisoners who had been designated as experimental subjects. These things are true, and they are not made less true by the fact that the men who did them also loved their children. The children knew the love firsthand and learned the rest secondhand, from documents and testimony and the expressions on people's faces when they heard the family name, and they had to build lives out of that combination without any template for how to do it. Some of them found something that worked. Some didn't. Some are still out there, elderly and private, carrying names that arrive before they do in every room they enter, waiting for a resolution that isn't coming, because resolution isn't the kind of thing history provides. It documents, it records, it remembers, but it doesn't resolve. That work, if it gets done at all, happens inside individual people, across individual lifetimes, quietly, without ceremony, loose in the space between who their fathers were and who they managed to become. For some of them, that space was wide enough to live in. For others, it never opened at all. If you found this story thought-provoking, make sure to follow for more untold histories that challenge what we think we know. Leave a like if this changed your perspective, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done in their place?